The termination meeting lasted 6 minutes. Ethan Carter counted them because he needed something precise to hold on to while everything else blurred. 6 minutes from the moment the HR manager closed the glass door to the moment she slid a white envelope across the table like it weighed more than his future. "We're restructuring," she said, reading from a screen instead of looking at him. "Your role is being eliminated." Ethan nodded. He had expected something, just not this. Across from him, his manager leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression rehearsed. He had been smiling an hour earlier, joking about coffee prices and quarterly bonuses. "This isn't about performance," the manager added quickly. "You're talented. This just isn't the right fit." Ethan didn't respond. He was watching the reflection of himself in the glass wall. Young, black, 26, suit bought on sale but pressed carefully. He looked calm. He didn't feel calm. "Your access will be revoked by the end of the day," HR continued. "It will escort you to your desk." Escort, like he might steal something. As he stood, his manager finally met his eyes. "You'll land on your feet," he said, voice low, almost kind. "Maybe try something less theoretical next time." That part hurt more than the firing, because Ethan hadn't been theoretical. For the past 8 months, he had been building a model no one wanted to see. Ethan joined Halcyon Capital straight out of grad school, top of his class, quiet reputation for being frighteningly thorough. While other junior analysts chased short-term signals and flashy dashboards, Ethan focused on correlations that felt wrong. Debt ratios that looked healthy on paper but behaved strangely under stress. Liquidity assumptions that only worked if everyone kept believing at the same time. His model didn't predict profits, it predicted fragility. He had presented it twice. The first time, his manager smiled politely. "Interesting academic exercise," he said, "but markets don't collapse like that anymore." The second time, a senior partner interrupted him halfway through. "You're overfitting fear," she said. "Clients don't pay us to imagine disasters." After that, Ethan kept working quietly. He refined the model at night, ran scenarios no one asked for, tested historical crashes against modern instruments. The results never changed. Everything was connected, and it was all too leveraged. The morning he was fired, Ethan had sent one last email to his manager, attaching an updated simulation with a simple subject line. "Stress scenario, please review." It went unanswered. Now, escorted by an IT staffer who avoided eye contact, Ethan packed his desk. A plant, a notebook filled with equations, a USB drive he slipped into his pocket without thinking. As he passed the trading floor, screens glowed green. People laughed. Someone rang the small brass bell they used to celebrate a good day. The market was calm. Too calm. Outside the building, the city moved at its usual speed. Taxis honking, people rushing, money flowing invisibly through systems Ethan understood too well to trust. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, box in his hands, watching the reflection of Halcyon Capital's logo ripple across the glass doors. They hadn't fired him because he was wrong. They fired him because his model asked a question they didn't want to answer. What happens when everyone is right at the same time until they're not? Ethan turned away and walked toward the subway. He didn't know when the crash would come, but he knew something far more dangerous. No one inside that building was prepared for it, and the model they had dismissed was already counting down. Ethan didn't go home right away. He rode the subway to the end of the line and back again, sitting between strangers, the white box on his lap like a quiet accusation. The noise helped. Metal on metal, announcements cutting through thought. It kept his mind from spiraling too fast. By the time he reached his apartment, it was dark. He set the box down, took off his jacket, and opened his laptop. The instinct was automatic. He didn't need access to Halcyon's systems anymore. He had already copied what mattered. Sanitized data, public indicators, historical feeds. Enough to keep testing. Enough to keep asking the question no one wanted to sit with. He ran the model again. same result. He adjusted assumptions, same result. Removed outliers, same result. The system didn't care that he'd been fired. Over the next few weeks, Ethan settled into a strange rhythm. Mornings were for applications, tailored cover letters, careful explanations, polite language that avoided words like systemic risk and collapse. Afternoons were for consulting gigs that paid little but kept the lights on. Nights were for the model. He stripped it down, then rebuilt it cleaner, more elegant, less academic. He turned it into something decision-makers might actually understand, if they were willing. He sent it out, not everywhere, just to a few places he respected. Independent research firms, risk committees, a former professor who now advised regulators. Most didn't respond. One replied with a single sentence. Interesting, but too pessimistic for the current climate. Another suggested he frame it more constructively. Ethan learned to translate his warnings into softer language. He talked about nonlinear stress amplification instead of collapse, about liquidity sensitivity instead of panic. He learned how to make the truth easier to swallow without changing it. Still, doors stayed closed. Then the cracks started to show. At first, it was small things. A mid-sized fund gating withdrawals, temporarily. An earnings call where executives spent more time reassuring than explaining. Volatility spikes that didn't match any obvious news. Ethan watched it all quietly, logging anomalies the way he always had. His model began flashing warnings more frequently, not because the inputs changed, but because the system's tolerance for shock was thinning, like a bridge holding just fine until it didn't. One evening, Ethan received a call from an unfamiliar number. "This is Daniel Wu," the voice said. "You sent me a paper last month." Ethan sat up straighter. Daniel Wu ran a small but respected macro fund. He had a reputation for listening longer than most. "I did," Ethan said. "I didn't agree with all of it," Daniel continued, "but I couldn't break it either." That was the highest compliment Ethan had heard in months. They met 2 days later in a quiet coffee shop. No suits, no slides, just notebooks and questions. Daniel pushed back hard. Ethan answered calmly. They went line by line through assumptions, edge cases, incentives. After 2 hours, Daniel closed his notebook. "If this is right," he said slowly, "a lot of people are exposed who think they're insulated." Ethan nodded. "That's the problem." Daniel studied him. "Why'd they fire you?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because I kept asking what happens when correlation stops behaving." Daniel laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Yeah," he said, "that'll do it." Daniel didn't offer Ethan a job. He offered him something better. "I can't make this public," Daniel said. "Not yet, but I can position for it, and I can give you a platform." Ethan understood immediately. "You want me to keep refining it," he said. "I want you to keep telling me when I'm wrong," Daniel replied. Ethan agreed. They worked quietly. No announcements, no predictions blasted across social media, just positioning. Hedges layered carefully, exposure reduced where it wouldn't be noticed, capital preserved instead of chased. Meanwhile, at Halcyon Capital, the screens stayed green. The brass bell rang often. Ethan still watched from the outside, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached concern. He recognized former colleagues on panels, on TV, talking confidently about resilience and innovation. None of them mentioned leverage. None of them mentioned what happened when trust thinned all at once. The night before the first major break, Ethan couldn't sleep. He ran the model one more time. For the first time, it didn't just warn, it aligned. Inputs synced in a way he had hoped never to see. Ethan closed his laptop slowly. The crash was no longer a possibility, it had become a schedule. And the company that fired the junior analyst was still operating under the assumption that the most dangerous risks were the ones you could already see. The first headline broke just after markets closed on a Thursday. A regional lender announced unexpected liquidity constraints and suspended withdrawals. The language was careful, almost apologetic, but Ethan recognized the phrasing immediately. It was the same kind of sentence he had flagged dozens of times in his model, the kind that sounded contained until it wasn't. By Friday morning, 2 more firms followed. Nothing catastrophic yet. Commentators called it isolated. Analysts reassured viewers that fundamentals were strong. Executives went on air and smiled the way people do when they're trying to project calm instead of feeling it. Ethan watched from his kitchen table, laptop open, coffee untouched. His model didn't react emotionally. It adjusted. Correlations tightened. Liquidity buffers shrank. Counterparty exposure spiked in places that had never mattered before, until suddenly they did. The system wasn't collapsing yet, but it was losing its margin for error. Daniel called him before noon. "You seeing this?" Daniel asked. "I've been seeing it for weeks," Ethan replied. "This is just the part people can't ignore anymore." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "We're ahead of it," he said. "Barely." That afternoon, volatility jumped hard enough to rattle desks, but not enough to trigger panic. Funds rebalanced, algorithms kicked in. The brass bell rang at Halcyon Capital, just like always. Inside that building, people congratulated themselves for dodging the worst of it. Ethan knew better, because his model wasn't reacting to headlines, it was reacting to behavior. Over the next 10 days, the cracks widened. Credit spreads crept outward. Overnight funding costs rose in places no one monitored closely. Firms began pulling back from each other, not publicly, but quietly, in ways that never made press releases. Trust thinned, and once trust started thinning, leverage became poison. On the 11th day, the thing Ethan had feared most happened. Correlation went vertical. Assets that had no business moving together suddenly did. Hedging strategies failed simultaneously. What was supposed to offset risk amplified it instead. Models built on historical separation collapsed into the same trade at the same time. Ethan stared at his screen as the indicators lit up. Not red, but white. System saturation. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with confirmation. This was it. The scenario no one wanted to believe in because it made everyone responsible at once. Daniel called again, voice sharp now. "We're cutting more exposure. Regulators are starting to ask questions." "They'll be late," Ethan said. "They always are." By the end of the week, markets dropped hard enough to make history. Trading halts, emergency meetings, central bank statements that tried to sound decisive while admitting very little. Halcyon Capital's name appeared on a list of firms facing significant stress. Ethan saw it while scrolling, the logo unmistakable. He didn't smile. He felt tired. Emails began arriving from people who had ignored him months earlier. Former colleagues, risk managers, even someone from HR. "Can we talk? We didn't realize how serious your concerns were. Are you available to consult?" Ethan didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he sent one message to Daniel. "They're about to realize the problem isn't liquidity," Ethan wrote. "It's confidence, and confidence doesn't come back on schedule." Daniel replied a minute later. "Agreed. Stay close." As the crash deepened, a strange thing happened. People started looking for explanations that weren't just numbers. Journalists searched for voices who hadn't been surprised, analysts who had warned without screaming, quiet models that hadn't relied on optimism to function. Someone found Ethan's old paper, then another did. By the time a major financial outlet published a piece titled "The Model That Saw It Coming," Ethan's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. His name appeared in interviews, in internal memos, in conversations that suddenly included the word systemic without apology. And at Halcyon Capital, where screens now glowed red and voices stayed low, a senior partner pulled up Ethan's final email. The one with the subject line, "Stress Scenario. Please review." For the first time, they opened the attachment. And in that moment, Too late to change the outcome, but early enough to understand the cost, they realized the junior analyst they had fired hadn't been pessimistic. He had been precise, and the model they dismissed wasn't predicting the crash anymore, it was explaining it. By the time the emergency summit was called, the damage was already measured in futures and fear. Executives flew in overnight, regulators arrived with binders no one had time to read. Screens in the conference rooms streamed numbers that moved faster than language could keep up with. The talk was about containment now, about confidence, communication, restoring order, about sounding calm enough to make it true. Ethan wasn't in the room. He sat in a quiet office Daniel had arranged for him, blinds half closed, model running in a steady loop. The work had changed. He wasn't forecasting anymore. He was mapping contagion, how stress migrated, where it pooled, which assurances would fail first. He wrote notes by hand, slow and deliberate, the way he always had when the stakes were real. Daniel stepped in mid-morning, jacket off, tie loosened. "They want you on a call," he said. "Regulators, a couple of firms, including—" He stopped. "Including Halcyon," Ethan finished. Daniel nodded. "They asked if you'd consult." Ethan closed his notebook. He thought about the 6-minute meeting, the white envelope, the word escort. He thought about the bell on the trading floor, ringing while the system hollowed out beneath it. "I'll talk," he said, "on conditions." The call was tense from the first second. Faces filled the screen, some familiar, some not. Titles did the talking before anyone spoke. When Ethan joined, there was a brief, awkward pause. Someone cleared their throat. A senior regulator started. "Mr. Carter, thank you for making time. We understand you've been analyzing—" "Systemic fragility," Ethan said calmly. "Yes." A few eyebrows lifted. They asked him to summarize. Ethan didn't present slides. He didn't dramatize. He explained, step by step, how leverage and correlation fed each other, how confidence acted as an accelerant, how models optimized for normal days collapsed together on abnormal ones. He pointed out where reassurance would backfire, where liquidity injections would help, and where they would not. When he finished, the room was quiet. One executive finally spoke. "Are you saying this gets worse?" Ethan nodded. "Before it stabilizes, yes. The question is how much damage you're willing to admit now to prevent more later." Silence again, this one heavier. They asked him what he would do. "I'd stop pretending this is a surprise," Ethan said. "I'd communicate plainly. I'd protect plumbing before optics. And I'd stop punishing people for saying uncomfortable things." The call ended without applause, without agreement, but with something else, alignment. Not on outcomes, but on reality. Over the next weeks, the market bled, then steadied. Some firms failed, others merged. A few survived because they had listened early enough, quietly enough. Reports were written, committees formed, language changed, so did Ethan's life. He declined a dozen offers that came with visibility and noise. He accepted one role, small title, real authority, advising a cross-institution risk council with a mandate that didn't include spin. He hired people who argued with him. He protected them when they did. At Halcyon Capital, the reckoning was internal and unglamorous. Leadership turned over. Apologies were drafted and never sent. In a closed-door meeting months later, someone suggested reaching out to Ethan again, formally this time. The suggestion was noted. Nothing came of it. Ethan didn't need closure, he needed continuity. One evening, long after the headlines moved on, he reopened his old model and archived it. Not because it was wrong, but because it had done its job. The next work would be different. Less about warning, more about design. He shut down the laptop and looked out at the city, lights steady now, traffic moving, systems breathing again. The company had fired a junior analyst because he didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. His model predicted the crash because it didn't care about stories. And in the quiet after, as institutions relearned the cost of ignoring precision for comfort, Ethan understood the final lesson the hard way had taught him. Truth doesn't need a title to be true, it just needs someone willing to carry it until the world is ready to listen, and brave enough to keep building when it finally does.